Welcome to another edition of The Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Have you ever watched a massive, world-captivating protest just erupt? Seemingly overnight, filling the streets, completely dominating the news cycle, only to watch it mysteriously fizzle out a few months later without actually achieving any lasting structural change? It's honestly one of the most fascinating paradoxes of our modern era. Today, we're going to dissect the anatomy of these protests. By digging into recent research, we are going to uncover exactly why massive digital age movements can mobilize so incredibly fast, but then kind of stumble when it comes to actually crossing the finish line.
Which brings us to the critical question anchoring our whole explainer today. Can leaderless movements actually sustain change? We live in this era where social media can summon literally 1 million people to a city square in hours, completely without a traditional leader giving orders. But does this decentralized networked approach actually have the long-term viability needed to rewrite laws and rebuild institutions? Or is leadership just an inescapable requirement for lasting impact? Let's find out.
Section 1. The Rise of Aragaleia.
To really ground this analysis, let's look at a brilliant real-world case study. Just picture the sheer scale of the 2022 Aragaleia protests in Sri Lanka, centered right in Gali face. Driven by this absolutely crushing economic and governance crisis, citizens took to the streets in droves. And what happened wasn't just a big crowd. It was immense symbolic power. It represented this collective, largely youth-led demand for accountability, fueled by profound frustration. And the crazy thing? There was no single commander directing this sea of humanity. It was a completely spontaneous, decentralized occupation of public space that sent absolute shockwaves through the political establishment.
And man, the timeline is wild when you see how rapidly this movement built up. In early 2022, severe economic hardship basically acted as the spark. By March and April, mass protests began rolling across the entire country, leading right into that massive Galleyface occupation in April. And then, explosive initial success. In July, the pressure was so immense, it literally forced the president to resign. By all metrics of a traditional protest, that's an absolute triumph, right? But then look at what happens post-July. Almost immediately after hitting its peak objective, the movement falls into this steep decline.
Section 2. Strengths of Leaderless Movements.
So, to understand that sudden drop-off, we first need to break down exactly why these decentralized networks excel so much in their early stages. First up, they allow for highly inclusive participation. Because there are no rigid hierarchies, anyone can join, and everyone feels like a vital part of the cause. Second, they use rapid digital mobilization. Social media is basically the nervous system of the movement, spreading info instantly. Third, by occupying public spaces, they physically manifest their digital numbers. And finally, this generates just massive symbolic power and legitimacy. When the world sees that kind of unity, the demands become impossible to ignore. They achieve incredible short-term impact precisely because they aren't bogged down by bureaucracy.
Section 3. The hidden structural vulnerabilities. But, okay, here's the plot twist. After achieving that initial objective, the movement fractured. Think about the stark contrast in organizational models. On one hand, you have the raw, powerful, kind of chaotic energy of a massive crowd. On the other hand, you have established organizational structures, like your traditional hierarchical pyramid, the hub-and-spoke model, or a completely leaderless resistance made up of autonomous cells. Now, in the early days of a protest, being a collection of autonomous cells is honestly a superpower. You can't be easily stopped or decapitated by the authorities. But when it's time to transition from shouting in the streets to actually writing policy in a boardroom, those decentralized cells lack the stability, the control, and the unified voice of a traditional hierarchy.
And this perfectly illustrates a huge paradox. The exact same features that enabled rapid growth, they became fatal limitations. The movement had mass mobilization, legitimacy, and inclusivity down perfectly, but because they had no formal leadership structure, they suffered from intense internal fragmentation the second that initial emotional peak subsided. Crucially, without leaders, they faced severe sustainability issues and incredibly weak negotiation capabilities. You can't fit 1 million people at a negotiating table, right? You absolutely need representatives.
To really grasp why this lack of negotiation power is so fatal, we need to introduce a quick concept from conflict resolution theory called BATNA. That stands for the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Honestly, just think of BATNA as your leverage. It's what you fall back on if negotiations totally fail. A strong BATNA means you have great leverage. A weak one means you kind of just have to take whatever deal the other side offers you.
So let's map this onto our case study. The protesters' BATNA is essentially just continue protesting. The government's BATNA? Maintain the status quo and wait them out.
But here is the critical flaw. A leaderless movement cannot effectively wield its baton. Without a defined leadership team to threaten the continuation of protests, or to promise the end of protests in exchange for policy changes, their leverage just evaporates completely. The government eventually realizes there's no single entity to actually negotiate with, so they just wait for the crowd to naturally disperse.
Section 4. Diagnosing the reconciliation gap.
Scholars actually use a specific academic autopsy tool to diagnose exactly where these movements break down. It's called the MERV framework, and it outlines 3 necessary phases to transform a raw protest into lasting political reality. Step 1 is mobilization, getting people to recognize the injustice and take action. Step 2 is empowerment, coordinating collective actions to defend rights. And step 3 is reconciliation, and that's utilizing political and legal avenues to advocate for systemic change and demand formal accountability.
Now, when researchers apply this MER framework to the Hierarchies movement, the discrepancy is pretty glaring. During the mobilization phase, their performance was exceptionally strong. They literally brought the country to a standstill. But during the reconciliation phase, the phase that actually requires strategic frameworks, legal maneuvering, and structured conflict resolution, their performance was fundamentally weak. They simply did not have the organizational machinery in place to convert their street power into lasting policy reform.
Section 5. Comparing global social movements.
So you might be wondering, is this just a uniquely Sri Lankan phenomenon? Well, no. When we broaden our lens to other modern digitally driven movements like the Argalaya or the Arab Spring, which are characterized by leaderless or mixed structures, the outcomes are consistently short-term, partial, or unstable. They're great at toppling governments, but they really struggle to build new ones. Conversely, when we look back at historical movements like the Civil Rights Movement, which featured strong, defined, and highly structured leadership, we see long-term, sustainable success. The data shows structured movements are significantly more likely to achieve lasting change.
Section 6. The ultimate leadership lesson.
Synthesizing all of this data, the crucial takeaway is this. Contemporary research heavily frames leadership as an adaptable, networked process today, rather than just a boss barking orders. But make no mistake, structured influence is absolutely required. Without it, movements just succumb to internal fragmentation. Strong leadership drives sustainable change. Weak or non-existent leadership yields only a temporary impact. It's like you can start a huge fire without a structure, but you cannot build an engine without one.
I want to leave you with this synthesis drawn directly from the event analysis. Movements peak when emotion and participation align, but decline without strategy and leadership. It's such a powerful reminder that while technology has completely changed how we gather, it hasn't changed human nature or the actual mechanics of power. So, as you watch the next great social movement unfold on your screens, ask yourself, have they figured out the leadership paradox, or are we just watching another brilliant, fleeting spark? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you see.